The carriage hadn't even come to a complete stop when she heard those words. The wind, carrying the rain, poured in through the cracks in the window, bringing with it the distinctive smell of rust from the northern mining region. Lya clutched the marriage contract on her lap, her fingertips icy cold. Outside the carriage door, 2 coachmen were handing over duties. Their voices were hushed, yet the wind carried their words into the carriage. "Did you hear? The stand-in bride from the Everlin family has arrived." T.S. key, they shoved her onto the carriage, without her even seeing the groom's face. "She doesn't know, does she? No one's told her a thing." Told her what? The 2 children at the Earl's estate. In that moment, it felt as though all the blood had been drained from Lya's body. Children. What children? Her knuckles turned white as she clenched her fists. The marriage contract crumpled in her hands, creasing precisely where the Duke's signature lay. Adrian Valentine, the Duke of the North, renowned for his ruthlessness, the man rumored to have had his political enemies nailed to the walls of deep mines as a warning. The alley her father had traded his daughter for. He had children, and yet not a single soul. Not her father, not the matchmaker, not the Duke's messenger, had ever mentioned a word of it. She had come to be the Duchess. No one had told her she was also to be a mother to children who didn't even exist. The carriage door was pulled open from the outside. Cold rain poured in, instantly soaking a patch of Lya's skirt. The butler stood on the stone steps like a rain-soaked statue, staring at her expressionlessly. "Miss Evelyn, His Grace, the Duke is waiting for you in his study." Lya stood up, her legs weak. She gripped the iron frame of the carriage door, rust digging into the spaces between her fingers. She looked at the massive gray mansion before her, its towers piercing the rain clouds, the candlelight in the windows like rows of open eyes, all watching her, all waiting to see how she would die. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stone steps. The sound of her boot heels, striking the flagstones, was drowned out by the rain. As she crossed the hall, her peripheral vision swept over the massive oil paintings hanging on the walls. The ancestors of the Valentine family looked down on her, their stone-like faces filled with judgment. At the end of the corridor, candlelight flickered. She saw 2 things, a half-open door, and a pair of eyes peering through the crack. A child's eyes. Those eyes met hers for only a second before the door closed. The sound was faint, yet it felt like a knife thrown through the crack, piercing her. Lya did not stop. The butler pushed open the study door, took a step back, and left her standing in the doorway. Adrian Valentine stood before the fireplace, his back to her. Dark hair, broad shoulders, his figure like a blade hewn from the rocks of the north. He did not turn around, nor even look back. The fire in the hearth cast his shadow across the entire wall, enveloping half the room and her. Lya opened her mouth, wanting to confront him. What was the matter with the child? Why hadn't anyone told her? She accepted that she was a pawn, but she couldn't be placed on a chessboard without even knowing what it looked like. Yet before the words could reach her lips, they were choked off by the rage and fear churning in her chest. She feared that if she spoke, her voice would tremble. At that moment, Adrian spoke. "Miss Evelyn." His voice was colder than the rain. "You need not know anything. Not written in the engagement contract." The blood rushed to Lya's head in an instant. He knew. He knew she had seen the child. He knew every surge of shock and anger churning within her right now, and he didn't care. He didn't even intend to explain. Every word of that sentence told her the same thing. "You don't matter. You're just a signed document. One I bought from your father." She clenched the ties of her cloak, her fingernails digging into her palms. The pain briefly steadied her. Her gaze swept across the desk where a document lay open, not the marriage contract, but an agreement for the transfer of mining rights. Her name was listed in the appendix, sandwiched between tonnage figures and shipping routes. like a piece of merchandise. He turned to face her. His gray-blue eyes were like a lake beneath a layer of ice. He looked at her, but there was no curiosity in that gaze, no scrutiny, not even disgust. Only a bottomless indifference, as if she were not a person, but a procedure that had to be completed. You will stay in the East Wing. The wedding is the day after tomorrow. Do not have contact with anyone on the estate during that time. Anyone. The word snapped shut around her like a lock. Lya did not curtsy. She turned and walked out. Her back was straight, but she knew her hands were trembling. Not out of fear, it was because she had suddenly realized a fact more terrifying than the deception itself. This man not only did not need a wife, he did not even need her to be alive. All he wanted was the marriage contract itself. The hallway grew darker. The butler had vanished without her noticing. Lya stood alone at the center of the cross hall, surrounded on all sides by identical corridors, each leading into unknown darkness. She didn't know which way to go. Her breathing grew more rapid, the echoes bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. Then she heard it, a faint sound, the sound of bare feet on stone tiles. Not one, two. She snapped, her eyes open. At the end of the corridor, two children stood there, like figures stepping out of a painting, yet more unsettling to her than any of the ancestors in the paintings. The girl was about 8 years old, with black hair and her chin slightly raised, her posture like that of a young wolf. The boy hid behind his sister, his light blonde hair a tangled mess, his fingers clenched tightly around the hem of her nightgown. They were both barefoot, and she didn't know how long they had been standing on the cold stone tiles. What sent a chill down Lya's spine most of all were the girl's eyes. Those were not a child's eyes. There was hatred in them, not the capricious, whining kind that could be soothed with candy in the next moment. It was a settled, betrayed hatred, the kind only adults possess. An 8-year-old girl, gazing at her with such eyes, as if she were an intruder who had trespassed onto her territory. Who are you? The girl spoke. It wasn't a question, it was an interrogation. Her voice was childish yet steady, a steadiness that sent shivers down her spine more than any scream could. She tilted her chin slightly upward, shielding her younger brother completely behind her, a posture identical to that of the man in the study. Lya slowly crouched down, keeping her eyes level with the girl's. She didn't move closer. Her instinct told her that if she did, this girl would bite. "My name is Lya," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am the Duke's." She choked on her words. She didn't know how to define herself. Wife, fiancée, a clause in a contract. The girl finished her sentence for her, her voice like shards of ice falling to the ground. "You are the one who is coming to marry him." The candle flame in the hallway flickered violently, as if startled by those words. The rain outside suddenly intensified, pelting the glass with a sharp crackling sound. Lya looked at the girl's face, at everything churning in her eyes, anger, wariness, and a vast, carefully concealed fear. In that moment, Lya suddenly understood. She wasn't looking at a child who resented her stepmother. She was looking at a tiny warrior fighting with all her might to protect her territory, and those eyes were still waiting for her answer, waiting to see if she was an enemy or just another person destined to vanish. Lya crouched on the cold stone tiles, her skirt soaked through. Behind her lay the cold Duke's silent command, "Do not touch anyone." Before her stood two hidden children who should never have existed in her life. She was stuck in the middle, like a wedge driven into the most secret crack of this mansion. What she didn't know was that once that crack was pried open, what would pour out from within would leave no one able to turn back. Lya didn't answer, because something was shattering in that girl's eyes. It wasn't her who shattered it. It was the name itself, the one who married him, that came crashing down. Isabel's lips were pressed into a thin line, her chin trembling slightly, but she didn't cry. She clutched her brother's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Leo peeked out from behind her, his light, gold eyelashes fluttering twice. His voice was thick and sticky, laced with the soft, drawling accent of a child from the north. "Sis, is she going to leave?" "Leave." The word fell onto the stone pavement, bounced up, and struck Lya in the chest. Isabel didn't answer her brother. She stared at Lya as if sizing up a door in an unfamiliar hallway. Good or bad, leading to safety or danger. Then with a calmness no 8-year-old should possess, she said, "You'd better leave tonight." At the end of the hallway, a gust of wind poured in through a window that hadn't been shut tight, snuffing out 3 candles on the wall in a single breath. Shadows surged forward like a tide, flooding half of Isabel's face. She stood in the shadows, the other half of her face bathed in candlelight. The turmoil in those eyes made every hair on Lya's back stand on end. This wasn't childish caprice. This was experience. "They've all left," Isabel said, her tone as flat as if she were reciting a recipe. "The first one stayed 3 days, the second a week, and the third—" She paused, her eyes unblinking. "She was the kindest to us. She promised to take us to the market in the south and buy us gingerbread. The next morning her room was empty." Lya crouched on the cold stone tiles, her hands still outstretched. Her knees were starting to go numb, and the part of her skirt soaked in dampness had chilled right through her skin. But she couldn't move. She watched Isabel's mouth move, each word like a shovelful of dirt, burying every last shred of her remaining illusions about this place. "Why did they leave?" Lya asked, her voice so soft she could barely hear it herself. Isabel glanced at her. There was no contempt in that glance, no anger, only the kind of weariness and resignation that comes when a child is forced to grow into an adult. "What do you think my father would have told them?" The wind blew through the corridor. Another candle went out. Now 5 were out. Shadows swallowed half the corridor, leaving only the one behind Isabel flickering desperately, stretching her shadow into a slender, black silhouette that didn't belong to a child. Something clicked into place in Lya's mind. The butler's Agnon. Adrian's "no need to know." The child never mentioned in the engagement contract. The hidden east wing, the graveyard at the end of the stone steps, glowing a grayish-white in the rain. That she was the best to us, in Isabel's words. The 4th, or perhaps the 5th. She'd lost count. How many women had this mansion devoured? And she, Lya Everlin, was the next to be served up. Number. She stood up. The movement was too sudden. Her knee gave a sharp crack. Isabel didn't step back, but simply pushed her brother further behind her. Leo's pale blonde head peeked out from behind his sister's shoulder, his eyes wide, radiating a tenderness and curiosity that seemed completely out of place in this mansion. He whispered, "Your skirt is wet." Lya glanced down at the hem of her skirt. It was wet. A dark stain was spreading upward from the hem, like a dark flag being raised. She took a deep breath, crouched back down in front of the 2 children, bringing her eyes level with theirs. "I'm not leaving," she said. Isabel's eyes narrowed. It was the scrutinizing expression of an adult, etched on the face of an 8-year-old, a jarring sight that tugged at the heartstrings. "They all say they won't leave. I don't have any gingerbread to promise you." Lya's voice was soft, but every word carried a weight that rose from the depths of her heart. "I don't even know how many drawers there are in your father's study. I don't know how many secrets are hidden in this estate's cellars. I don't know why he kept your existence a secret in the engagement agreement. Because we're his weakness." Isabel cut her off. 8 years old. The words came out like a dagger. Lya's breath caught for a second. Isabel watched her expression, the corner of her mouth twitching, not a smile, but a tactic a child learns to test an adult's true colors. "You think he doesn't know we're here? He knows everything. He doesn't let us see anyone. He says we're his." She paused, as if recalling a specific word, then mimicked that man's tone, enunciating each syllable. Weak link, weak link. A father who calls his own children a weak link. Lya felt a chill shoot up from the base of her spine and pierce the back of her head. Not from fear, from anger, a rage she'd been bottling up for a full hour in this estate, yet had found no outlet for. From the grooms, she doesn't know, does she? To the dukes, you don't need to know what isn't written in the engagement contract. To the butlers, don't have contact with anyone. To the sight of those two tiny figures wandering barefoot in their pajamas down the dark corridor, that rage had finally found its target. He isn't protecting you, Lya's voice deepened. She wasn't deliberately lowering it. Rather, something inside her chest was sinking, pulling her tone to a more resolute pitch. He's locking you away. Like two. She swallowed the word prisoners. But the look in Isabel's eyes told her the girl would fill in the blank herself. Proof, Isabel said. Lya froze. What proof? Footsteps echoed from deep within the hallway. The butler was coming back. Isabel's body tensed instantly. She grabbed her brother's hand and jerked back a step. Her face retreated into the half-light. But those eyes cast one last glance at Lya. It wasn't hatred anymore. It was a test. She was tossing a stone to see if Lya could catch it. The stone was still in mid-air. The butler appeared around the corner of the hallway, his expression even more grim than before. He saw Lya crouched on the floor, face to face with the two children, her lips pressed into a pale, gray line. His gaze swept over Isabel, then shifted away as if he dared not look directly at the child. Madam, you should return to your room. The words were a command, cloaked in polite language. Isabel said nothing. She took her brother's hand and turned to leave. Leo's pale blonde head glanced back at Lya, his small hand clenched tightly in his sister's palm. Barefoot on the flagstones, their footsteps grew fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. The butler offered no explanation. He didn't even look at Lya. He simply stood sideways, one arm pointing stiffly toward the east wing, like a wound-up automaton. Lya paused for a second as she passed him. How many of them left? The butler's shoulder twitched. He didn't answer. 3, 4, or more. Silence. But the silence itself was the answer. Lya clenched her fists, her nails digging 4 crescent, shaped white marks into her palms. She didn't ask again. She walked into the room in the east wing and closed the door behind her. The fire in the fireplace was still burning. The curtains were still billowing in the wind. Outside the window, the graveyard grew darker in the rain. The grayish-white headstones stood like a row of fingers reaching out of the ground, beckoning to her. She pressed her hand against the glass. This time, she didn't feel the cold. She felt the heat. Anger burned in her chest, scorching away her fear, consuming her obedience, and searing through all the manners and restraint she had been trained to uphold for 17 years. She had married into a prison built of stone and secrets. The man she married treated her like a piece of paper. His children were hidden at the end of the hallway, like 2 ghosts whose existence had been erased. And before her, woman after woman had vanished from this mansion. No one had ever looked for them. No one had ever asked about them, as if their lives were truly worth no more than a marriage contract. But not her, Lya Everlin. She turned and walked to the desk, opening a drawer. It was empty. She pulled open another. Inside was only a leather, bound notebook, its cover frayed and worn. She flipped to the first page, where a woman's handwriting. The ink faded to a pale brown, yet the characters clear red. Day 13. He didn't come today. The children are crying at the end of the hallway, and I'm not allowed to go. I hear Isabel calling for Mommy. She's not calling for me. She's calling for the one before me. Lya's finger pressed against the line, her fingertip feeling the indentations in the paper. The one before me, Mommy. Isabel isn't calling for me. She's calling for the one before me. She turned the notebook to the last page. The handwriting had become scrawled, as if written in haste. He's raising an army in the vein. He isn't mining. He's digging. The writing broke off here. The ink traced a long diagonal line, stretching from the middle of the page all the way to the edge, like the final trace left by a hand that had been yanked away. Lya closed the notebook and tucked it into her shirt. The hard leather cover dug painfully into her chest. In that moment, she knew she wouldn't leave, not to give that 8-year-old child a gingerbread cookie, but so that child would never have to call the wrong person Mom again. The wedding took place on the 3rd day. No, not a wedding. It was an exhibition. Lya stood at the entrance to the manor's small chapel, watching the candlelight spill out from between the 2 open oak doors. There were no flowers, no music, no chatter from the guests, only the sound of the northern nobles' boots clicking against the stone floor as they filed in, a dull, rhythmic thud, like the drumbeat of a funeral. She clutched the bouquet in her hand, one the butler had shoved into her this morning. A bunch of white heather, its stems still dusted with the grayish, white powder characteristic of the North's mineral veins. The stems had been cut too short, and they dug uncomfortably into her palm. She stood in the shadows outside the door. No one came to escort her in. No father was there to take her arm, no bridesmaid to adjust her train. She wore the wedding gown sent by the Duke's estate. The wedding gown was a misnomer. It was really just a silver-gray evening gown, its cuffs and collar embroidered with the Valentine family crest. The crest depicted a soaring falcon, clutching a vein of ore in its talons. It looked menacing, as if it were about to swallow her whole. The butler's voice came from inside the door, devoid of any emotion. The ceremony for the betrothal of His Grace, Duke Adrian Valentine, and Miss Lya Everlin, is about to begin. He didn't even say, wedding, he said, betrothal ceremony, as if he were reading the signing procedure for a business contract. Lya took a deep breath and walked up the stone steps. Candlelight flickered on the walls on either side. The nobles on the benches turned to look at her. Their faces, in the play of light and shadow, resembled a neatly arranged row of playing cards. No curiosity, no blessings, only scrutiny. Some whispered behind their fans. Others sized her up with their eyes. She was the second daughter of the Everlin family, sent as a substitute bride. Everyone knew it. Her sister had run away, and she had come to fill the void. In the eyes of these northern nobles, she wasn't even worthy of a full name. She was merely the stand-in bride of the Everlin family. Adrian stood before the altar, his back to her, dressed in a black ceremonial robe. His shoulders were straight as a line, his figure like a cleaved cliff face. He did not turn around, from the moment she stepped into the small chapel until the moment he was supposed to turn to greet the bride. He did not move a muscle. Lya walked up beside him. He didn't look at her. The priest began reciting the vows. His voice echoed hollowly off the stone walls, like a fly trapped in a jar. Lya didn't hear a single word. Her attention was drawn to 2 people in the 4th row of pews on the right, Isabel and Leo. They had been seated in the farthest corner. Isabel wore a black dress that was clearly too short, its lace cuffs yellowed. Leo's shirt collar wasn't ironed flat. One corner was turned up. They sat there, not like the Duke's children, but like 2 poor distant relatives who'd been crammed in at the last minute. No one looked at them. No one spoke to them. 3 seats remained empty around them, like an invisible ring of isolation. Isabel's gaze swept across the aisle, fixing directly on Lya's face. That look was exactly the same as the one in the hallway 2 days ago. Alert, probing, and tinged with a deeply hidden fear. Leo's small hand clutched his sister's sleeve. His light blonde head rested on her shoulder, yet his eyes never left Lya. He mouthed 2 words, Mom. There was no sound, but those 2 silent words punched a hole right through Lya's chest. Just then, the priest spoke his final words. If anyone believes this marriage should not take place, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The chapel fell silent for 3 seconds. A log in the fireplace crackled. A nobleman coughed. No one spoke. Lya opened her mouth. I have something to say. Her voice was not loud, but it bounced back and forth between the stone walls, striking every ear. The fans on the benches stopped waving. The priest's hand froze midair. Adrian finally turned his head. His movement was slow, like an iceberg pivoting. And for the first time, something that could be interpreted as surprise appeared in his gray, blue eyes. Lya set down the bouquet of heather she held. She turned to face the nobles, seated on the 2 rows of benches. Her fingers trembled, but she kept her voice steady. 2 days ago, crouched in the corridor, with her knees pressed against the damp stone tiles, facing 2 barefoot children, she had been unable to make a promise. Now she could. My name is Lya Everlin, she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. My betrothal contract stated only one thing, to marry the Duke of Adrian Valentine. But no one told me there were children in this estate. No one told me that the man I was to marry kept them hidden in the north wing, forbidding anyone from approaching them. No one told me how many women had been shoved into this position before me, and vanished from it. A stir broke out among the nobility. Some gasped. Others muttered curses under their breath. One man stood to speak but was pulled back by a neighbor. Adrian's brow furrowed, his lips twitched, but Lya didn't give him a chance to speak. She had been holding it in for 3 days. In those 3 days, she had swallowed enough humiliation and fear. Now she was going to spit it all out in one breath. I won't leave. She looked at Isabel, her voice suddenly cracking. That night, you asked me if I would leave. I said I wouldn't, but I know you didn't believe me, because in your 8 years of life, not a single woman has ever stayed. Isabel sat in the corner, her back straight as a taut string. She wasn't crying, her face was expressionless, but her hands were trembling. She held her brother's hand, their 2 small hands clasped tightly together on the hem of her black dress. Lya turned her head, raised her gaze, and looked over Adrian's shoulder at the stained glass window above the altar. Depicted there were the ancestors of the Valentine family, their features blurred, each clutching a sword and a miner's hammer. She raised her voice, driving every word like a nail into the stone ears of those ancestors, into the chests of every noble present, and into the heart of the man standing before her. The man who had never once looked her in the eye. I have no gingerbread to promise you. She looked at Isabel and stopped herself there. Then she turned to Adrian, meeting his gray, blue eyes for the first time without flinching. But you and your brother won't have to search the hallways barefoot for your mother anymore. I'm here. I am your mother. The room fell deathly silent. Then Leo wriggled free from his sister's grasp. The 6-year-old boy slid off the bench, his bare feet touching the cold stone tiles. He wasn't wearing shoes again, and ran down the aisle, throwing himself into Lya's skirt, his face buried deep in the folds of her skirt, his small fingers clutching her belt. His voice came through the layers of fabric, muffled and hoarse, yet clear as day to everyone's ears. Ma. Isabel didn't move, but tears welled up in her dark eyes, not flowing silently, but falling in a torrent as if a dam had burst. She was 8 years old, and she had sworn never to cry again. She sat on the edge of the bench, her body stiff as a board, her tears soaking a patch of her yellowed lace collar. Lya held Leo's tiny body close, feeling his shoulders shake. Her gaze swept past the flickering candlelight and the frozen faces of the nobles, landing on Adrian. His face had changed. Not anger, not humiliation. It was collapse. That wall built of northern stone, that line of defense constructed from 7 years of silence, the place where that woman had sealed him away with the final brick. It was cracking. starting at the corner of his eye. An almost imperceptible tremor began to pulse, then spread to his jaw, then to his clenched fists. He was gripping so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, yet his hands were shaking. The Duke of the North, renowned for his coldness, the man who had his political enemies nailed deep into mine shafts, the father who called his own child a weak link. His hands were shaking. He opened his mouth to speak. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Lya didn't wait for him. She bent down and picked up Leo. The boy immediately wrapped both arms around her neck, burying his pale, blonde head in the hollow of her collarbone. His sobs were wet and hot, like a small animal soaked by the rain that had finally found its nest. She freed one hand and reached out to Isabel. Isabel was still sitting there, 8 years old. She sat on the edge of the bench, her body trembling uncontrollably. She looked at the hand Lya had extended toward her, staring for a long time. Then she slid off the bench and walked over step by step. No rushing, no hugging, simply clasping Lya's outstretched hand with her tiny fingers, so lightly, like a flake of snow landing in the palm of her hand. But she didn't let go. Lya straightened up, one arm holding the boy, the other holding the girl's hand, and turned around. She faced the eyes of all the northern nobles in the small chapel, the priest's gaping mouth, the altar, and the blurred portraits of ancestors above it. Finally she faced that man, Adrian Valentine, her husband, the master of this estate, the ruler of the northern veins. Standing before her now, something was shattering in his eyes, his lips trembling, his entire being like an iceberg crumbling. She looked at him and finished her final sentence, her voice steady, yet every word carrying a taste of rust. From today on, I will provide. On the dome of the small chapel, the stained glass windows hummed as the wind shook them. Outside the window, the rain in the north was falling harder and harder, pounding the stone steps, the dust of the ore veins, and the nameless headstones in that grayish, white graveyard. And within this 700-year-old stone manor, something was beginning to shift. It was awakening from its icy slumber. It was changing everything in a way that could not be reversed. The candlelight in the small chapel flickered violently, as if someone had splashed a bucket of invisible cold water into the air. The nobles sat on the benches, their faces contorted in the shifting light, some with mouths agape, forgetting to close them, others shielding half their faces with fans yet failing to hide their wide-eyed stares. Still others tracing clumsy signs of the cross over their chests, as if what had just happened demanded immediate divine intervention. The woman holding the child stood before the altar, a boy with pale golden hair in her arms, and a girl with black hair and a black dress at her side. She wore a silver-gray wedding gown, its cuffs embroidered with the Valentine family's falcon, and her back was held straight as a person standing atop ruins, with no intention of leaving. The priest was the first to react. He took a step back, the hem of his cassock brushing against the candelabra and nearly toppling the entire row of candles. He looked at Adrian, waiting for his grace's instructions, waiting for a rebuke, a command, a gesture that would tear this absurd farce to shreds on the spot. Adrian did not move. He stood there like a stone statue struck by lightning. A crack spread from the corner of his eye to his jaw, to his clenched fist, to the spine on his shoulder, a spine that had remained unbent despite 30 years of frost and wind in the north. His mouth opened, his lips moving as if to speak, but no sound came out. Or perhaps there was a sound, but it was buried too deep within his chest to escape. Lya looked at him. It was the first time she had met this man's gaze. Gray-blue like a lake beneath the ice. 2 days ago that lake had been frozen solid. Now the ice was cracking inch by inch, and something she could not fathom was surging forth from within. But she didn't wait. Holding Leo in her arms and leading Isabel by the hand, she turned and walked toward the door. The heels of her boots clacked against the stone tiles, each step steady and sure. Leo's arms were wrapped around her neck, his head buried in the crook of her shoulder, his warm breath dampening her collarbone. Isabel's fingers were clasped in her palm. The cold little hand was trembling, but it didn't let go. When she reached the doorway, Lya paused. She did not look back. The betrothal contract is in the drawer of my room. If you want to tear it up, go ahead. The words were directed at Adrian. Her voice wasn't loud, but it bounced back and forth between the stone walls several times, echoing into everyone's ears. She didn't call him, Your Grace, nor did she call him, my husband. She called him you. By the standards of the northern nobility, this was a grave act of disrespect, but in that moment no one dared to speak up and correct her. Then she walked away. The wind in the corridor swept against her face, carrying the scent of rain and ore dust. Lya took a few steps, and her knees suddenly went weak. The resolve she'd mustered in the small chapel was now draining from her body. Her fingers began to tremble, and a belated wave of fear washed over her. What had she just done? To expose the Duke's secret in front of everyone at the betrothal ceremony, to declare before all the northern nobility that she was the mother of 2 children she had never met, to deliver an invisible slap to the face of a man renowned for his coldness. Her father's face flashed through her mind. What expression would be on that face? Rage, fear, or that familiar disappointment she had seen all her life? Don't anger the Duke, the family needs him. The words burned like a hot iron on the back of her head. The man she had just angered was the most powerful man in the entire North. Leo stirred in her arms and whispered, Mommy, where are we going? Lya looked down at his face. Tears still clung to his pale golden lashes, and the tip of his nose was red. But the look in those eyes had changed. It was no longer the cautious scrutiny she'd seen in the hallway. It was a kind of unreserved trust she'd never seen in anyone's eyes before. He buried his face back into the crook of her neck, his tiny fingers clutching her collar as if she were the safest place in the world. Isabel said nothing. She walked beside Lya, her footsteps echoing in time with the click of Lya's boots on the stone tiles. Her face remained tense, but the hand clasped around Lya's was no longer as stiff as before. To the kitchen, Lya said, trying to keep her voice steady. Are you hungry? Leo's stomach answered for her, a rumble so loud it nearly made the armor at the end of the corridor vibrate in response. The corner of Isabel's mouth twitched, not a smile, but no longer the stony expression she'd used to test others. The kitchen lay between the east and north wings. When Lya pushed open the metal, clad wooden door, the cook inside nearly dropped her ladle into the pot. A plump woman, wearing a flour-stained apron, her face flushed with the healthy glow of someone who'd spent years by the hearth. She stared at Lya, the Duke's bride in her wedding gown, holding one child in her arms and leading another by the hand, standing in the kitchen doorway, her mouth agape like a fish just hauled from an ice hole. My lady, how did you? Is there anything hot? Lya asked. They haven't had breakfast. The cook froze for 2 seconds. Then she saw Leo's pale blonde head and the red rims of Isabel's eyes. Her expression changed. It wasn't deference nor fear, but a tenderness exceedingly rare among servants in the north. She turned, lifted the lid off the iron pot on the stove, and a cloud of hot steam billowed out, carrying the aroma of beef stew with carrots and potatoes. Sit by the stove. The blanket is behind the door. Don't let the young master and mistress get cold. Lya set Leo on a low stool beside the stove and fetched the old woolen blanket from behind the door to wrap him in. The blanket was large, almost wrapping him entirely into a ball, leaving only a small pale, gold head exposed. Isabel climbed onto another stool herself. Her legs were too short, and her feet dangled in the air, but she refused to let anyone help her. She sat there, the hem of her bleached, white petticoat peeking out from under her black skirt, her hands resting on her knees, her back held perfectly straight. The cook ladled stew into 3 bowls and pulled a few slices of bread from the oven. Stiff, hard rye bread from the north that would last a week without going bad. She glanced at Isabel, then pulled a small jar of honey from the back of the cupboard and set it on the table. "This is the last jar," she said to Lya in a low voice, her eyes drifting toward the hallway. "We saved it from last fall. The butler said we can't give it. We can't let them use it. We can't let them have it." When Lya heard those words, her fingers, which had been breaking off a piece of bread, froze. She thought of Isabel's skirt, which was a few inches too short, of Leo's shirt collar, which hadn't been ironed flat, of the empty seats at the very end of the bench where they'd been placed. Children hidden away, not just from the engagement, but subtracted from every detail of food, clothing, and daily life, like 2 expenses, jotted in the margins of an account book, cut wherever possible. She unscrewed the honey jar, scooped a heaping spoonful, spread it on the bread and handed it to Isabel. She scooped another spoonful and gave it to Leo. Isabel stared at the slice of bread for a long time. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes reddened again. But she didn't cry. She took the bread and took a tiny bite. Then she broke it in half, placed the larger half back on the table, and pushed it toward Lya. "You eat too." 2 words. Not madam, not mother, just you. But to Lya's ears, those 2 words carried more weight than any formal title. Leo had already finished half a slice of bread, his mouth stuffed full. He mumbled, "Mommy should eat too. Mommy's hungry." Lya smiled. She didn't even realize she was smiling. She hadn't smiled since she'd been shoved into the carriage 3 days ago. Now she was crouched before the hearth in the manor's kitchen, her skirt half soaked, a child in her arms who'd wiped her tears on her shoulder, and another child in front of her who'd broken a piece of bread and offered it to her. She smiled. Her eyes stung terribly, but she smiled. The cook stood by the stove, still holding the wooden spoon she'd used to stir the soup. She watched the scene unfold, a strange expression crossing her face. An expression of uncertainty, as if she didn't know whether to believe what she was seeing or not. This was the first time such a look had appeared on the face of an old woman who had spent 15 years in this mansion, witnessed one duchess after another come and go, and seen countless secrets. Then she did something. She set down the wooden spoon, walked to the kitchen door, and glanced down both sides of the hallway. After making sure no one was there, she closed the door and bolted it. "Madam," she turned around, her voice so low it was almost drowned out by the crackling of the fire. "Don't go back to the East Wing tonight." Lya looked up. "What do you mean?" The cook's plump hands rubbed back and forth over her apron. Her knuckles were bright red, scars from years of burns. She clenched her teeth as if making a decision, then pulled something out of her apron pocket, a rusty iron key. "I know a passage. It leads from the cellar to the edge of the vein. If the East Wing's doors are locked from the outside tonight." She paused, her eyes flickering. "You must leave. Take the child. Don't look back." The bread in Lya's hand fell onto the table. She stared at the iron key, then at the expression on the cook's face. Not a warning, but a plea. Here was a woman who had spent 15 years in the Northland Manor, entrusting her life to the pocket of her apron, and handing it to a woman who had been married into the household for less than 72 hours. She felt as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water over the back of her head. But beneath that bucket of ice water, something else was burning, something hotter than fear, deeper than anger. What had this man done? How many women's secrets had he buried within these walls? And how many had he silenced? Isabel slid off her chair. She walked over to Lya and stood between the 2 adults with her slender frame. She looked at the iron key in the cook's hand, then lifted her head and spoke in a tone of calmness uncharacteristic of an 8-year-old, draining all the air from the kitchen. My mother walked out that door. After she left, she never came back. The breakfast the cook had brought was cold on the tray. Lya had no appetite. She stood by the window, clutching the note. Someone who wants you dead in the north. The paper softened by the sweat in her palm, the ink bleeding out like a spreading shadow. Outside the window, the north sunlight fell on the gravestone, engraved with Eleanor's name, its surface reflecting a blinding white light that stung her eyes. The iron bars of the ventilation shaft had been pried open from the outside. Her mother wasn't beneath the gravestone. 8-year-old Isabel crouched in the dark mine shaft, alone, bearing witness to the truth. No one dared speak. "Did you go there alone last winter?" Lya turned around and crouched down so she was level with Isabel. The girl sat on the edge of the bed, Leo leaning against her shoulder, clutching a cold-baked potato and gnawing on it intently, oblivious to the adults' conversation. Isabel nodded once, her dark hair sliding down to cover half her face. Were there any signs of others having been there? Footprints? Scraps of fabric? Anything? Lya held back the urgency in her voice, not wanting to frighten her. Isabel nodded again, more gently, more imperceptibly, as if admitting this meant confessing a secret she had guarded for a whole year. Then she said, "There were candle stubs. I didn't leave them there." The cook made a muffled sound by the stove. Not a word, but the kind of sound that comes when your throat is blocked. She had her back to everyone, both hands braced against the edge of the stove. Her plump back looked like a rock beginning to crack. "When the lady was still alive," she said, her voice rough and hoarse, like sandpaper scraping against the bottom of a cast iron pot, she would go down to the cellar every week to select wine. She knew her wines. Red grapes from the south, ice white from the north. She could tell the origin just by the scent. Sometimes, after she'd finished selecting the wine, she wouldn't come upstairs, but would stay down in the cellar for a long time. I just assumed she liked the quiet there. It wasn't until later that I realized she wasn't there to select wine. In Adrian's study, the curtains were still drawn. Sunlight squeezed through the gaps in the curtains, carving a narrow beam onto the carpet like a knife dropped to the floor. He sat behind his desk, the ledgers of mineral deposits brought up from the cellar spread out before him. The dust on the covers hadn't been wiped clean yet, and the air was thick with the musty scent of aged paper and the distinctive rusty smell of northern ore. He flipped to the 7th volume, his finger pausing in the middle of a page. The numbers in that row had been altered. The ink was darker than the surrounding text, having been added later. The date of the amendment, October 7 years ago. He remembered that month. No, he wouldn't use the word remember. That month was seared into his memory, like a branding iron on an animal's hide. In early October 7 years ago, Eleanor died of postpartum fever. 3 days after the funeral, the mining rights for the eastern section of the vein were reassigned. That same month, the Everlin family sent representatives to the north for the first time to discuss a partnership. It had been less than 4 days since Lya had married into Valentine Manor. When she knelt in the hallway facing the 2 barefoot children, her eyes stung but she did not cry. She declared in front of everyone, "He needs me, and I need you." Every word struck him where he dared not be touched. Adrian closed the ledger. Dust swirled up, dancing in the beam of light. He stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains. Sunlight poured in, flooding the entire study. He saw the cemetery behind the estate and Eleanor's name, blindingly white in the sunlight. He stared for a long time, then spoke a single sentence, his voice so low only he could hear it. "Were you afraid back then, too?" In the hallway, Lya held Leo's hand, while Isabel walked on her other side, still clutching the empty honey jar. Leo's shoelace had come undone again. He crouched down and clumsily tied it in loops using the technique he'd just learned, his tongue poking out from the corner of his mouth, as focused as if he were defusing a bomb. Isabel looked down at him, then bent over to take the shoelace, her fingers flipping it twice to tie a knot. As she straightened up, she suddenly asked, "Are you going to look for that candle stub?" Lya's steps faltered. She looked down into the girl's eyes, dark, bright, no longer the probing, scrutinizing gaze of 4 days ago, but one ready to follow. "You guessed," Lya said. "You asked such detailed questions just now. It didn't sound like you were just making small talk." Isabel shifted the honey jar to her other arm, her voice steady. "If you're going to look for it, I know the way." Lya stood in the middle of the hallway for a moment. Ahead lay the great hall, where the butler and 2 footmen were polishing the armor on the weapons rack, the metal's glint dancing across the vaulted ceiling. Behind her lay the path to the kitchen. The cook was likely still at the hearth, where the fire never went out. Upstairs lay Adrian's study. She didn't know if he was inside, nor what he'd uncovered while poring over those ledgers. But she knew she was clutching a note in her hand, hiding it in her sleeve, with an iron key tucked under her pillow, and standing beside her were 2 children who had already lost a mother once. She said, "Wait until Leo falls asleep tonight." That night, Leo curled up in bed, clutching a blanket, his thumb in his mouth, snoring softly. The fire had been stoked down to a minimum, leaving only a layer of dark red embers flickering faintly beneath the ashes. Lya fished the iron key from under her pillow. The metal felt cold, its rusted edges pricking the skin of her palm. Isabel was already standing by the door, having slipped on the old boots the cook had secretly sent. They were too big, so she'd stuffed cotton into the toes to muffle the sound of her footsteps. The candles in the corridor had almost all gone out, leaving only the night lamps, one every 20 paces, casting a dim, yellowish glow on the stone walls. Their shadows stretched, now long, now short. As they passed walls hung with portraits of ancestors, those ashen faces gazed down at them from the shadows. Isabel led the way, stepping around the loose floor tile in the corner of the hall. She knew which one would creak, and stepped over it. Lya followed behind, realizing that this 8-year-old girl knew this mansion far better than any map. She had memorized every flaw that might betray their presence, with the soles of her feet. Which door in which corridor had rusty hinges, which corner lay on the butler's nightly patrol route. She knew it all. For 7 years, she had navigated the mansion's veins every single night. They reached the kitchen. The cook was waiting at the door and shoved the lit lantern into Lya's hands. The wick was twisted down to a tiny flame, just enough to illuminate 3 steps ahead. "The entrance to the cellar is behind the back row of wine racks in the pantry," she said. "Push the 3rd wooden panel on the left. Part of the passage has collapsed, but you can squeeze through if you turn sideways. Go all the way to the end, and you'll reach the ventilation shaft. Don't stay too long. Cold drafts sometimes rush into the mine tunnels, enough to freeze a person's bones brittle." She turned and took 2 steps before coming back, pulling 2 hot potatoes wrapped in cloth from her apron pocket and pressing them into Isabel's hands. "Here, eat these on the way." When the wooden panel behind the wine rack slid open, a wave of musty, cold air surged out, carrying the scent of ore, mold, and something even older, like a secret that had been locked underground for far too long. Lya held the lantern up in front of her and crouched to squeeze through. Isabel followed close behind, her steps even steadier than her own. The mine tunnel was narrow, with cold droplets seeping from the stone walls on either side. The air was so humid that every breath felt like drinking water. They walked about 200 paces, passing a collapsed section, a slope of rubble that had just barely left a gap wide enough for one person to squeeze through sideways. Isabel pointed to the ground beside the rubble, where a small white object lay, covered in dust but intact. A candle stump. It had been burned. The wick was charred, and wax drippings had hardened on the stone. Lya crouched down, careful not to touch it directly, and held the lantern close to examine it. The wax was white, not the yellow church wax, but the more expensive white beeswax. Only noble families in the north could afford such candles. She looked up. The mine shaft stretched on ahead, and in the darkness she could faintly make out the shadow of an iron gate at the end. "The ventilation shaft is just ahead," Isabel whispered, though her voice still echoed in the narrow space. Lya stood up and walked toward the iron grate. The grate was rusted beyond recognition. The lower section had been pried open from the outside, bending 2 bars outward to create a gap just wide enough for a slender person to squeeze through. She and Isabel were just about to reach the grate when a sound came from deeper within the mine shaft, like feet crunching on gravel or someone pressing down on something in the darkness. A human voice, faint yet crystal clear, echoed muffled through the stone walls. "Don't go over there." Then came the sound of metal scraping against rock. Lya grabbed Isabel's arm and pulled her behind her. The lantern wobbled, its flame flickering violently inside the glass shade. She raised the lantern higher, but the light was limited and couldn't reach the source of the sound. It came from a narrower side tunnel on the left, its entrance half covered by a loose plank of wood, a faint glow seeping from the edge. Someone was inside. They weren't the only ones underground in this estate. Isabel gripped her fingers. Her palm was clammy with sweat, but she didn't make a sound. Lya turned the lantern's flame down to the lowest setting, nearly extinguishing it, leaving only a pinprick of light. She held her breath and took another step toward the side tunnel. The voice from inside the tunnel sounded again. "We can't go up now. The Duke has been poring over the ledgers in his study all day. The council members have already set out. Our people aren't in place yet. If you're discovered now, Eleanor's efforts will have been for nothing." The glass shade of the lantern was so hot she could barely hold it. Lya covered the shade with her other hand, smothering even the last pinprick of flame. The mine shaft plunged into total darkness, not the kind of black found on an ordinary night, but the black of the deep underground, with millions of tons of rock pressing down overhead, where even the air seemed to squeeze against her eardrums. She crouched behind a wooden plank at the fork in the tunnel, one hand clutching the extinguished lantern, the other holding Isabel firmly pressed against her back. The girl's body was trembling, her teeth were clenched tight, and she made not a sound. Lya pressed her ear against the rock wall. Icy droplets seeped from the cracks, dripping onto the nape of her neck and trickling down her spine. The voices from the side tunnel sounded again, closer now, close enough to hear the phlegmy rasp in the speaker's breath. It wasn't a northern accent. This person's vowels were flatter, with a slight upward inflection at the end. A southern accent, the accent of the capital. The council sent armed guards. They weren't here to investigate. The voice was hushed but urgent, as if trying to persuade someone. "They've obtained the old mining records for the eastern section of the vein, and there's a name in there you shouldn't have signed. How many times have I told you not to leave a trace on the documents? Now look, once the ledgers are sent to the capital, it won't just be him who dies. You won't escape either." Another voice came from deeper within, broken and intermittent, as it echoed off the stone walls. It was a woman's voice, very low, her tone so calm it made Lya's blood run cold. "I don't care if he dies, but the child must not come to harm. If she dares lay a finger on Isabel and Leo, I'll make her vanish from this estate as completely as those women before her." The hairs on the back of Lya's neck stood on end. Those women before her. It was as if a row of candles had been lit simultaneously in her mind. The first stayed for 3 days, the second for a week. The third was the kindest to the children, promising to bring gingerbread. They didn't run away. They were eliminated. The person responsible was right there in this mine, shaft beneath her feet, less than 20 paces away. But what truly sent a chill through Lya's body wasn't those words. Who was the woman speaking? She realized this woman knew Isabel and Leo. She would kill for the children and referred to anyone approaching them as touching my children. The cook said the real mistress had gone missing 7 years ago. Isabel said there was no mother beneath the gravestone. The iron bars on the ventilation shaft had been pried open from the outside. The accent of the capital, a name that shouldn't have been signed. Eleanor's sacrifice couldn't have been in vain. She suddenly clenched Isabel's wrist, feeling as though she were touching the edge of a conspiracy far larger than this estate. Isabel shifted behind her. Lya felt the girl's fingers release the hem of her dress. then trace a letter in the palm of her hand. What? Before she could process it, the woman's voice from the side corridor spoke again. The council is coming next Wednesday. You must make the ledgers disappear from the study. Her tone was as matter of fact as if she were instructing the kitchen to prepare dinner. The Duke has already grown suspicious these past few days. Last night, the butler told me he's moved all the old files on the eastern section of the vein into the study. If he discovers that the blast 7 years ago wasn't an accident, if he discovers that there's more than just rock buried beneath that vein. She paused, a flicker of emotion appearing in her voice for the first time. Not fear, but something deeper, more complex. If he discovers I'm alive, he'll certainly reinvestigate that fire. And you know what lies buried beneath that fire, don't you? Silence. Then the man with the southern accent spoke a sentence. Lya didn't fully understand. Your sister is already dead. You didn't just burn the eastern section of the vein. You burned our only chain of evidence. The woman's voice gave a cold laugh, as icy as the water seeping from the depths of the northern mines. My sister chose this herself. When she married into Valentine Manor, she should have known her days were numbered. I merely made her death serve a purpose. An image flashed before Lya's eyes, Eleanor's gravestone glowing a pale gray in the rain, inscribed with "died of postpartum fever," while Isabel stood in the hallway, speaking with the calmness of an 8-year-old. She wore a blue dress the night she left. She said she was going to the cellar to fetch a bottle of wine. She kissed my forehead. She never came back. The woman in the blue dress wasn't dead. She was alive. She had been orchestrating a 7-year scheme deep within the mine shafts, using her own daughter's loneliness as the price. And that phrase from just now, your sister, had torn an even wider gash in the entire picture. It wasn't Eleanor buried in that grave. It was another woman, a decoy, a pawn sent into a death trap by her own sister's hand. Isabel wrote another letter behind her. Lya felt that cold little finger moving slowly in the palm of her hand. As the third letter fell into place, her hand began to shake violently. Isabel wrote the second letter with an A. Before she could finish the third, footsteps in the side tunnel suddenly moved toward the exit. Lya was running out of time. She yanked Isabel to her feet and sprinted back along the mine tunnel they'd come through. She couldn't see a thing in the darkness, relying solely on her memory of the path they'd just taken. The slope of loose rubble, the narrow crevice in the collapse zone, just wide enough for one person to squeeze through sideways. Then 200 paces straight ahead to the wooden plank behind the wine rack. She ran stumbling and stumbling, her shoulders slamming into the rock wall. The pain shot from her collarbone down her entire right arm. But she didn't stop. Isabel was dragged along behind her. Her boots were too big, and one fell off. But the girl didn't look back to pick it up. Her breathing was rapid and restrained in the darkness. When the wooden panel behind the liquor rack slid open, the kitchen stove was still lit. The cook wasn't at the stove. She was sitting on a low stool by the doorway, a rolling pin clenched in her hand, her eyes fixed on the hallway like a sheepdog guarding a pen. Hearing the noise, she spun around, rolling pin raised. But when she saw it was them, she slumped back onto the stool as if all the air had been let out of her. You were gone so long, I thought her eyes were already red. Isabel stepped out from behind Lya, 1 foot bare, her black hair a tangled mess, her face smudged with dust from the mine shaft. But her eyes were dry. She walked up to the cook, and in a tone that didn't sound like an 8-year-old, a tone that seemed to have been repeatedly scalded and then cooled, she distilled the words she'd just heard in the mine shaft into a single nail, driving it into the air of the kitchen. My mom is still alive. She's been hiding under the vein for 7 years. She has a sister. Her sister is dead. She's waiting for something, or for someone to die. The cook's face lost its color inch by inch in the light of the stove fire. Then she did something that made Lya's jaw go slack. She didn't look shocked, and she didn't ask, "Are you sure?" She simply set the rolling pin down on her knee, placed her 2 rough, reddened hands on top of it, bowed her head, and spoke in a voice so soft it seemed completely at odds with her own. "I know. I've known all these 7 years that she was still alive." The church bells struck 12 at noon, sending layer upon layer of echoes crashing off the stone walls of the entire estate. As the sound traveled through the mine shafts, the rocks flattened its pitch. By the time it reached the room in the east wing, only a faint, muffled echo remained. Lya stood at the window of the east wing room, gazing at the gravel path outside the estate gates, pitted and rutted by the rain. 4 riders appeared at the end of the road, clad in black cloaks, their horses kicking up muddy water that splashed onto the withered grass on either side. The rider on the lead horse held a banner, not the Valentine family's falcon, but the emblem of the Royal Capital Mining Council, a pickaxe, and a scroll crossed on a shield. They were 3 days early. The note said next Wednesday. Today was Monday. Lya let the curtains fall and turned away. Isabel sat on the edge of the bed, retying her brother's shoelaces. Leo lay on the carpet, building a wobbly tower out of building blocks. The cook stood in the doorway, a fresh grease stain on her apron. Though she held no cooking utensils, she pressed 2 letters into Lya's hands, one delivered by the butler that morning, sealed with the Valentine family's falcon seal. Inside was Adrian's handwriting. Just 8 words: "No matter what happens, stay in your room." The wax seal on the other letter was deep blue, just like the note the cook had given her last time. The handwriting was the same. The paper was from the same batch. But this time the wording was no longer a warning, but a command. "The council is entering the estate with an armed escort. The ledger and any witnesses must be dealt with by noon. If the Duke interferes, he is to be taken into custody as well." There was no signature below. That evening, when the rain had stopped, Adrian returned from the capital. Isabel was the first to hear the hoofbeats. Barefoot, she ran from the kitchen into the hallway, her skirt billowing in the draft, her black hair flying behind her. Leo followed close behind, still clutching a half-eaten, gnawed down piece of gingerbread. The cook rose from the stove, her apron still tied, a wooden spoon still in her hand. She stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the 2 children run down the long corridor, past the walls hung with portraits of their ancestors, across the cold stone tiles they had walked barefoot for 7 years. The hall door swung open from the outside. Evening light poured in, stretching the shadow on the threshold into a long black silhouette. Adrian stood there, weary from his journey, a new shallow scar running from his cheekbone to his jaw, a tear in the cuff of his shirt. But his eyes were no longer the gray, blue waters beneath a layer of ice. He watched the 2 children running toward him, bent down, and lifted them both at once, one in each arm. Isabel buried her face in her father's collar. It was stained with the dust of the northern veins and the smell of horse sweat from the royal road stations. But she didn't let go. Leo poked his father's cheek with a gingerbread cookie and said, "Daddy, there's a red line on your face." Adrian didn't answer. He held the children a little tighter, resting his chin on the top of Isabel's head, a soft, muffled sound rolling in his throat, one only the children in his arms could hear. Lya stood at the end of the hallway. She didn't run. She simply leaned against the kitchen doorframe, holding a bowl of freshly ladled stew, its steam washing over her face. She watched the man carry the 2 children across the hall, the heels of his boots tapping out a steady, heavy rhythm on the stone tiles. As he walked toward her, step by step, he stopped in front of her and set the children down. Isabel's feet touched the flagstones, but she didn't move away. She pressed herself against her father's leg and looked up at Lya. Adrian reached into his coat and pulled out a document sealed with the Privy Council's wax, placing it on the table. "The vein is saved." His voice was hoarse but steady. "The Crown has withdrawn all charges. Madeleine will be exiled, not executed. I traded 5 years' worth of mining taxes from the eastern sector for her life." Lya looked down at the document, the royal griffin seal pressed into the wax. She didn't ask for details. She simply set the stew on the table, turned, took another bowl from the stove, filled it, and placed it in front of Adrian. Then she knelt down and tucked Isabel's tousled hair behind her ear. The girl's dark eyes were bright and tearless, but her eyelids were red. Lya whispered a sentence, meant only for her ears. "Your father has returned. Your mother's name will be engraved on the tombstone, and you won't have to search the corridors for anyone anymore." That evening, the cook stewed 3 large pots of beef and potatoes and opened the last jar of honey from the pantry. The butler was, for once, forced to sit down in a chair, a bowl of hot soup pressed into his hands. The old foreman from the mines came with his wife, the man named Grigory, the very one who had dug Eleanor's ring out of the collapsed tunnel 7 years ago. His rough fingers trembled as he returned the ring to Adrian, but he said nothing, merely clasping the Duke's hand firmly. At the long table, Isabel and Leo sat right in the middle, each holding a chicken drumstick, their faces smeared with grease and honey. After gnawing on his drumstick, Leo held the bone high in the air and announced loudly that he could eat another one. Isabel smiled, not just a slight twitch of her lips, but a genuine grin that showed her teeth. At the far end of the table, Adrian stood up, raising his cup. It held the most common ale from the north. The clamor in the hall gradually subsided, and everyone turned to look at him. His gaze swept over everyone at the table, his 2 children, the cook, the steward, the old miner, a few servants, and finally settled on Lya, sitting across from him. "I'm not very good at saying things like this." He raised his glass, the candlelight flickering on the rim. "But today is the first time in 7 years that anyone in this manor has truly enjoyed a proper meal. Not because some important figure has arrived, nor because a contract has been signed. It's because she has taught us all one thing. Happiness isn't something you invent. It's something you pick up, piece by piece, from the hands of your own father, from a rotten marriage contract, from the abyss and the dark depths of the mine shafts. You pick it up, wipe it clean, and then use it." He paused, his Adam's apple bobbing, his gray-blue eyes shining brilliantly in the candlelight. "This one's to you, Lya Valentine." The cook was the first to tap her wooden spoon against her soup bowl, producing a crisp clang. Then the entire long table erupted with clinking glasses, applause, and Leo's giggles. Isabel set down her chicken bone, cupped her hands to her mouth, and shouted to Mom. And when she finished, she didn't blush or look embarrassed. She just glanced at Lya, as if to confirm it was safe to say the word. Lya nodded at her through the steam rising from the potatoes and the jars of honey scattered across the table. Her eyes sparkled, but the corners of her mouth were turned up. Late that night, Lya sat on the edge of the bed in the east wing. Leo was already fast asleep, curled up into a tiny ball, the blanket pulled up to his belly, revealing 2 feet clad in woolen socks. Isabel hadn't closed her eyes yet. She was leaning against the headboard, flipping through an old book. On the nightstand sat the empty honey jar and a ring that had been repolished. Scars from the fire still marred the falcon's wings, but in the glow of the hearth fire, those marks were no longer wounds, but textures. Adrian pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was still barefoot, his soft-soled slippers left outside the door. He glanced at his son, who was already asleep in bed, and his daughter, who was pretending to be asleep, then sat down in the chair beside the bed. For a long time, he said nothing, just sat there, watching the fire cast the shadows of his wife and children onto the stone wall, where they flickered quietly and endlessly. Then he spoke, his voice soft, as if afraid of waking anyone, or as if he had finally allowed himself to be heard. 7 years, I locked myself in my study. For 7 years, I thought that if I didn't look at them, I wouldn't think of her. I thought that as long as I took another wife in name only and kept her there, this house could keep running. I was wrong. The very first night you walked into this estate, when you crouched in the hallway and told Isabel, "I won't leave," I knew I was wrong. He lowered his head and looked at his hands. They were hands capable of signing mining permits, hands that could grip a heavy sword on the battlefield, yet hands that could not reach the head of his own son. He slowly spread his hands open on his knees. The night Eleanor left, She was wearing a blue dress. She told me to go to the cellar and fetch a bottle of wine. I said, "All right." Those were the last words I heard from her while she was alive. Lya stood up from the edge of the bed. She didn't speak. She simply walked over to him and placed her hand in the palm he'd laid open on his knee. His fingers closed around hers slowly, as if afraid of crushing something. Her palm pressed against his warm, dry, and smeared with a bit of honey she'd picked up from the stove during dinner. Outside the window, a crack had opened in the northern sky. Moonlight seeped through the clouds, illuminating the oak grove behind the estate and the new headstone beneath the trees, where a single line was inscribed: Eleanor Ashton Valentine, mother of Isabel and Leo, who loved and was loved. In front of the headstone, a bouquet of wild heather had been placed that evening. The petals were still dusted with the grayish, white powder characteristic of the ore veins. Lya had picked them by the roadside. As she placed the flowers beside the base of the monument, she offered no prayer, spoke no words to herself. She merely reached out to wipe away a speck of mud splattered on the stone, stood up, turned around, and saw 3 people standing at the edge of the oak shadow: Adrian, Isabel, and Leo. They stood there waiting for her, barefoot, in the warm, soft earth of the Northlands after the rain. Tomorrow, someone would come to repair the floor in the north wing. The day after, the cook would bake fresh honey bread. The passage deep within the vein would be sealed off again. But before it was sealed, Adrian would have a hawthorn tree planted outside the ventilation shaft. Isabel said her mother liked hawthorn blossoms. She was talking about the mother in the blue dress. Now, she had 2 mothers to speak of. At this moment, in this 700-year-old manor, the door to the easternmost room stood ajar. The fire in the hearth burned warmly. 2 children slept beneath soft quilts, a jar of honey placed within their reach. Their father sat in a chair by the bed, and their mother sat beside him. This was an ordinary night at Valentine Manor. Winter was approaching. A faint muffled rumbling echoed from deep within the mine. There was much to do tomorrow, many accounts to settle, many wounds to tend, but that was all for tomorrow. For now, they simply sat together, listening to the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustling of the north wind against the stone walls. It was not the end, it was the beginning